How do appraisers value pools? My name's Jake. I'm a real estate appraiser. I'm also a real estate broker for 20 years now, and I also have a pool. So, first, we're going to ask a question, and it might fool you a bit. Are pools worth more in warmer climates than colder climates? And I find usually the answer is no, they're not actually. Believe it or not, they can be a lot more valuable in places like New York, Chicago, New Jersey, Boston, St. Louis, whatnot. But when you compare that with Miami, Houston, LA, Phoenix, and Las Vegas, which is the opposite of what you would think. So imagine you have a nice neighborhood in Miami, and 9 out of 10 people want to have a pool in this neighborhood. And you have 9 out of 10 houses that have a pool. So that's an even supply and demand. Now let's take a place in like New Jersey or New York, Chicago, whatnot. And let's say only 2 out of 10 buyers want a pool. That's a lot less demand. But you only have 1 out of 10 houses have a pool. So now you have a out of balance supply and demand. And that can be the case in a lot of these northern climates. And so as a side note, this is when you initially ask an appraiser how much is a pool worth. You get these generic answers like it depends. Well, it depends on the market, because it could not be worth very much, or it could be worth quite a bit. And I'll explain all of that. Generally, it's a supply and demand issue is why you're going to have higher values. So what impacts supply and demand? First off, climate. We talked about that. Of course, it's very obvious that demand is lower in northern climates because it's so much colder in a shorter swim season. And that's the obvious. Everyone understands that. Here's a couple other things that you may have not thought about, though. Regional. When you're up in New York, Chicago, these northern regions, they have a strong union presence. So they got higher wages. And when you go down south, you have lower union presence, lower wages. So that can impact the cost of a lot of these items. And when you get into pools, you're talking plumbers, electricians, concrete workers. So if they can make a lot more money doing their union things, they're not going excavators, they're not going to charge cheaper for pools. The other thing is, you have a lot more skill in building pools in the South, just because you do have so many more homes with pools. That means the people who do have skill in the North have little competition, and the people who have skill in the South have more competition, and that's driving prices down. The third thing that impacts supply and demand a lot is national issues. So one more recently was COVID. Everywhere is closed down across the country. This is really worldwide. And people want to still swim in their backyards. They still want to get together with family or friends. And so you see this huge demand to have in-ground pools. And the builders were just swamped with work, but they could not keep up with the demand. So that's a national issue. On a side note, when I first started doing appraisals, the general consensus was they're not worth very much. Pools, maybe 10 grand, and they probably only cost 20 or 30 grand back then for an average pool. They've doubled at least now. But I noticed actually when pools first started to go up, and they were worth a lot more than just 10 grand. And it was during the mortgage crash in 2008. I started to notice everything's going down. Foreclosures are everything. But some of these homes weren't really suffering so bad. They were selling still quickly. They were selling still high. And I started to think, why is that? And they had pools. And I'm like, why are the homes with pools selling so high? Because when the mortgage crash came and everyone's in economic despair, they still wanted pools. And the big way that they built pools was they refinanced their home to pull out the equity to build the pools. Since everybody was upside down in their mortgage during this mortgage crash, a lot of people, they couldn't access that equity, that capital to build a pool. So you still had the demand, but you had low supply. A lot of pool builders, if you talk to them, they didn't really even work for a few years after the mortgage crash 2008. People just, or they did service only for existing pools. They weren't building new ones because nobody had the money to build them. Few exceptions for very wealthy people, but the average person could not pull out equity in their home or didn't want to. The market was different. And so when I saw that, I realized pools are worth a lot of money, and it is really important to do your supply and demand analysis in whatever market you're in, because you cannot make assumptions. You cannot just assume a northern climates regionally in the north are cheaper than the south because they use them less or the demand's lower. You really have to look at the market, and that's true. And appraisers should know that. Some of them just haven't done the research in the last couple of years or 5 years. And the reason why, it is a lot of research for a pool. And I'm going to show you how we do research to determine an exact value for pools, adjustments that we make. Now, as far as supply and demand, I'm pretty bullish on the demand. I think buyers are going to keep wanting pools. I think even rental buyers want pools now for short-term rentals. They want to offer a pool for Airbnb. So you see a lot of demand. Even with the Airbnb slowing down, you see it being a preference to buy a house with a pool. And I think the supply is still going to remain pretty low in some markets, especially the northern ones. Because if you have a skill to build a pool, you may have moved down south to use that. Or you're doing something that's more valuable, like excavating for basements rather than excavating for pools, something that doesn't really exist in a lot of southern markets. So I'm thinking demand's going to keep going up, supply is going to keep going down. That's my outlook. So how do appraisers determine value? We look at market data, sold homes, basically. One of the best ways to determine an actual value of a pool is you have this is hypothetically a paired sale. You have a home that's sold for 120 that has a pool. You have a home that's sold for 100 identical without a pool. And you would say, oh, okay, the pool's worth $20,000. That's called a paired sale. In practice, and I'll show you, you're not going to find two identical homes that sold. Even if you do find two identical homes where one has a pool, one doesn't, it may have sold a year or two ago, and then you got to adjust for market differences. So it can become difficult, but you can still find them, and good ones too. But you just have to consider it's not going to be this hypothetical book situation. So I'm going to show you some on my screen here. I don't know if you see this, but there's just some random house I picked. It's a nicer home. It looks like a cathedral or something on these pictures. I just flipped through pictures pretty quickly. Sometimes they put this pool in the last area. So this is I'll show you the difficulty in doing paired sales. You got to flip through all these pictures. It takes a lot of time. You're looking at the house. So you got a pool area out here. This is probably gunite pool with Pebble Tech or something. It's got some type of concrete coping or whatnot. So, and a tile surround. It's got a lot of outdoor areas. So here's a pool. And it's got a sport court. You'll see things like that. So that's important to make note of. And let's see, that sold for $4 million. So let's say here's a home in the neighborhood, only sold for $3 million, doesn't have a pool. And you think, okay, the difference is $750,000. You think that pool's worth $750,000? Maybe, but here's the problem. This house isn't nearly as nice as the other house in other ways. It's smaller. It's 3,000 square feet smaller. So that's not a good paired sale because I got to consider how much was the pool, how much was the size. This is the problems appraisers are running into. So let's go look at a neighborhood where we have better paired sales. And this is a neighborhood I selected. It has pretty good paired sales. So you look right here, there's one for 607 and a home happens to be next door, sold for 520. So they're pretty similar in most regards. This 607, you're talking almost $100,000 there. And the main thing is he's got a vinyl liner pool. It's not real fancy in the houses. Okay, so just make note of that. This is the same neighborhood. We got another house here sold for 640. Has a pool. House next door, real similar house, sold for 545. I don't know, 95 grand, and the main reason is a pool. So these are really good paired sales. Here's another one. This is a ranch home. It's only 400 in the neighborhood. It's got a pool. And then you'll notice this other ranch home, just same neighborhood, right over here, sold for 375. So you're looking at 30 grand. But I will note that this 375 one backs to a wooded area. So it should be worth more because this one is back into a bunch of houses. So this one with the pool is still selling for more than this one. So when you're doing a paired sales analysis, you need to consider some things like that. Like I said, nothing's going to be perfect. So you're going to have to say this one has woods or it's more updated. You got to click through all these pictures to determine. So it can be very time consuming. And if you haven't done it in a couple years, you could have outdated appraisers that aren't really valuing things when they've increased dramatically. Here's another one for 640, and the one next door is 495, and they're pretty similar homes. They both back to this wooded retention pond area. So what's that? That's 145 grand, probably, and primarily the pool. I've flipped through these. I won't do that. So now, if you don't have paired sales, that's the best way to do it. You try to find something. So just looking at that, our lowest one was 30 grand, and our highest one was 5 grand. So that's a pretty big range still with these paired sales. Even though they were good paired sales, we're proving the pool's worth a lot of money. So we're going to have to narrow that down a little bit more. You can't just, that can make a big significant impact if you're making a $145,000 adjustment for a pool or a $30,000 adjustment. So how are we determining the differences? And I'm going to get into that really quick. But before I do that, let's talk about another market data approach. And this is called cost. So if you don't have any paired sales, think about hypothetically, if you bought a new truck for $100K, do you think someone's going to pay more than that for an old truck? No. So your cost is like your limit. So if you got a pool's going to cost 300 grand, people aren't going to pay more than 300 grand. So that is a theory you have to understand. So another way to make an adjustment is you can say, how much does this pool cost? Well, let's say it cost 100 grand. It's 10 years old. If you built it new, it'd be 100 grand. So since it's 10 years old, maybe it's only worth 50 grand. So you're depreciating that cost. Now, something you need to understand, this guy that paid 607 for this house, whoever built this pool, it was like 21 years ago. And this house is selling for 90 grand more or so than the neighbor's house with a pool. Now that pool probably did cost back 20 years ago 50 or 60 grand with all the stuff, but it's worth more than he paid. But if you were to build that pool now, it would cost well over 100 grand, especially with meeting the code. And the code in this area is going to require fencing and other features that aren't even related to the pool, but they definitely increase the cost of a pool. And we'll talk about all that too. So that's a less reliable approach to making an adjustment. You figure out what's the max cost and you figure out how much is depreciated. So if you have a pool that costs 100 grand and it's 10 years old, it's going to be worth more than years old or 30 years old or 40. And so you're depreciating those costs. That's not as reliable as a paired sale. A paired sale is way better because you have two exact homes. But a lot of appraisers will have to resort to these less reliable because you need evidence for why you're making your adjustments. So as you could see in this paired sales analysis, we got houses were worth 7% of the value. That was for the small sale for 400. Up to 14% of the total value was a pool. So we got a range of $30,000 to $145,000 for a pool. So how do we narrow it down? Let me get my things together here. So now we're going to take a closer look. Why is one pool worth 30, one worth 140? In the same neighborhood, mind you. So there's 4 main things I like to consider to narrow things down. So this is more of a micro level. So you got your adjustments going to be 30 to 145. And some appraisers might stop there and say, I think this pool's worth about 50 because it's whatever. I like to narrow it down a little more. So these are the 4 things. The first thing is the type of pool. Now, if you're a first-time pool owner or even an appraiser that doesn't own a pool or a professional agent or broker, you might not know the differences. But if you own a pool or you're an expert, you do know a lot more details about the pool. The 4 main types are fiberglass, vinyl, and a concrete type. Concrete includes gunite, shotcrete, concrete, poured concrete, concrete block, and then you have above ground, which we'll talk about too, but it's not legally real estate. So those are the four main types. And then you have subcategories of those. Some people will pour concrete walls and put a vinyl liner over it. Some people pour concrete walls and plaster it with different things like Pebble Tech, and that we'll talk about that. So those are the four types. How does that relate to value? Obviously, above ground's not real estate, so we'll talk. That's probably the least valuable, but the most valuable is typically concrete. Now you'll start figuring this out when you're doing multiple $1 million homes. They usually don't have a vinyl or above ground or fiberglass. They have a concrete type product, and they have. You'll just notice this with multiple $1 million homes. And let me show you an example of a fiberglass or vinyl. So you got a fiberglass pool sold for $485, this house. Then you have a vinyl sold for $485. So this is showing they're about equal. That's a little fiberglass pool in this house. And then the same house up the street, it's got a vinyl pool back here. So they're about equal, usually. I will say you have to consider the age too. Sometimes when a vinyl liner gets older, you can replace the vinyl and refreshen it a little easier than when you have an older fiberglass. You can do some things, but usually there's not a lot of refreshers. So they age out when you get over 30 years or so. So that's something to consider. The pool type is a value issue. It can, if you have this big range and someone has a gunite pool, you're probably going to pull that value range all the way up to that 145 or in that particular neighborhood we just looked at. And if someone has a tiny, old, 30-year-old, 20-year-old fiberglass pool, you might be a little lower on the 30 or 40 in our example that we just went through with paired sales. So that's one of the points. The second point I like to do, it's more than the pool. People sometimes build just a pool and that's it. But usually you get a hot tub, you get outdoor kitchens, you get fences, landscaping, retaining walls. If you've ever built a pool, you know about this. You'll get sports courts, you'll get little pool sheds to house things, and you'll get even elaborate pool houses and guest houses. So sometimes we'll adjust separately for a guest house. We won't include that in a pool adjustment. But a lot of these things are just going to be lumped in with the pool adjustment. But you have to consider if they have outdoor kitchens and if they have big pool decks, concrete areas and surfaces, more so than maybe some of your paired sales or your comps, then you need to slide that up on the scale. So that's the second consideration. It's more than the pool. So the third one is physical features. Is it a new pool? Is it an older pool? How far away from the house is it? Sometimes that can be real negative when they build way, way far away. It's not as usable. And a side note about builders, and I think builders are great. You should trust a local builder or whatnot, but sometimes the placement isn't for you and the value. It's for the ease of construction. They don't want to damage your home. They want to be further away. They want to get out. So just be aware of that. Sometimes if you put a pool too far away or where you place it can negatively or positively impact your value. The other things, how big it is, how small it is. So a bigger pool is usually worth more than a really tiny plunge pool. Not always, but in some markets it is. So you always have to look at the market data. Number 4 is the pool components, which is important to look at too. Pool heaters. Is it salt water? Is it chlorine? Does it have a sand filter, a cartridge filter? Does it have elaborate slides, lights, deck jets? Does it have what kind of plaster? Pebble Tech, Eco Finish, or is it just a real basic plaster that'll scuff up your feet? It's really rough. Those things matter. Pebble Tech, Eco Finish, those are going to be your higher end, and market participants know what they are. People who pay for them, people who buy pools understand that. And that's the thing. Some appraisers maybe don't know that much about pools. So you're going to have issues in that regard. But this is a consideration. Different copings, travertines, porcelain. Some people spray cool deck. So you do need to be aware of some of these things that impact the value. You might not be able to prove that people are going to pay a lot more because something has a cool deck or a Pebble Tech versus Eco Finish. But generally, you're going to see them in the higher paired sales. You're going to see these sales that happen real high, and they're going to have gunite pools. So you're going to be able to determine, you're going to be able to realize that this is appearing in the higher end homes. So if you're doing a house that has these, you don't want to compare it to the little tiny old fiberglass pools when you have a real big elaborate gunite pool. Let me just show you some examples in the market, some real market data here. There we go. Okay, so you got a 126-year-old home here. The reason I bring this up is it has a concrete pool. It's old, very old. It's probably the first concrete pool in the country. Actually, we had this pool builder here to build grain silos, and they held water, and he started building pools like 70 years ago. And these were concrete pools. They just pour concrete, or they put block and they plaster them with a cement-based. Sorry, they put these photos. This is why it's hard to do research. You want to see what's this picture look like. You got to flip through 100 photos, literally. So you start getting to them, and you can see it's a square pool. That's a concrete pool. They've updated it. So that's the thing. The point I wanted to make is even an old concrete pool, you can update. Historic pools, you're not going to be able to do that with every pool type. So concrete can be updated. They came in here and they've done some work. It's a lot of work, but they'll update them. And then here's another one, just an example. And they're advertising the pool right in this image of this home. They know, whoever's doing this knows a pool's worth a lot. Not everyone believes that or knows that or does their research, but you see a pool in these images, they know it's an important feature. First picture. I mean, they could have put the kitchen in there or whatever. Whoever is marketing this understands. So this is an example of it's more than the pool. So you got a pool, but look at all this significant landscaping, trees, view, covered areas. So you're going to have these mansions and they're not always mansions. Sometimes people there's pool people that just love pools. But you flip through these pictures, this is how you figure out what kind of quality condition. Every time I do research like this. So here's another example. You got a pool here, but there's a lot of very expensive patios and features that were built. How big is this patio? How much is the pool deck? How much is the patio? I don't know. So you have to figure out how much of an adjustment is this pool worth, and you have to consider these factors. Okay, let's talk about above ground pools. I do find that sales that have above ground pools do sell a bit more than the counterparts in the same neighborhood in that paired sales. And they have big decks wrapped around. They'll still have grill areas set up. People get pretty elaborate with some of the above ground pools, and they are nice, especially for the price homes they often appear in. The problem is it's not legally real estate. So as a real estate appraiser, you have problems with insurance. Do you get insurance that covers the pool? The banks won't let us value them because they're in the market for only loaning real estate. So even though it's worth some money, I can't value it as real estate. But what I will do is if I have 3 sales for 100, 100, and 120, and the 120 has an above ground pool, I'm not going to make an adjustment for 20 grand for an above ground pool, but I might think I'm going to just consider it at that higher range. Maybe I'll value it closer to the 120 because I do know that a lot of the above ground pools sell for more. So I'm not trying to say they're not worth something, but it is personal property. Even though you can't move them, they never get moved. They do depreciate faster than in-ground pools. What if I put the in-ground pool, above ground pool in the ground? So I recess it or I drop it in, then can you use it? And the answer is no. There's a difference in the construction of an above ground pool. They're, for one, not approved for ground contact or for that type of construction. They have much thinner metal or polymer walls than an in-ground pool, even though in-ground vinyl pools have a similar type. They have a metal wall or a composite wall or poured wall. And you have an above ground pool has metal too, but the in-ground pool is approved for ground contact, meaning it's significantly thicker steel. And then you also have the actual vinyl liners of an in-ground pool are significantly thicker. Even then you have to replace them every so often. But an above ground pool has, for example, non-virgin liners. Sometimes a recycled vinyl, while an in-ground will always have a virgin liner, meaning it wasn't recycled to make that liner. You also have situations with pumps, quality of the pumps, the filters, the heaters. They're just two different things for above ground. So like I said, above ground pool is worth more. than a home that doesn't a lot of times, for a newer one especially. And what I can give value to though is their decks, their patio areas, their built-in covered rear porches or pergolas if they're built in. So sometimes you can give them a little value and justify a little value for things that are real estate. So that's kind of how we have to deal with above ground pools. In summary, how much are in-ground pools worth? Probably a lot. And I expect future demand to only increase. They might cost more than they're worth initially, but they may appreciate more than other homes over time. Pools can be a very large percentage of the total value. I just showed you some that were 7 to 14%. So on average, 3 to 15%. And sometimes they're well over 20% of the total value of the home. So that's a pretty expensive component. Not all real estate brokers are going to appreciate the impact a pool could have, nor do they have the expertise to value them. So that kind of sums it up. I hope that really helps out a lot. Thank you from Jake, the real estate appraiser and broker.